On this Tuesday night, catastrophic flooding in California.
There's just a lot of infrastructure that isn't designed for drainage.
The destruction from a deluge, the rescues, and the fear of what's coming. A warning about our planet getting warmer.
The climate crisis is here.
The fight against rising temperatures and false information. Battle brewing. Alberta's premier pushing back on Ottawa's plan to help oil and gas workers transition to clean energy jobs. And would you wear these? How much dough you'll need to buy Nike's ode to Montreal bagels.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight in California, where flash floods, mudslides, and torrential rain is threatening millions of people. The onslaught of storms began in late December, and it has been relentless. Up to 18 centimeters more rain was expected today, adding to weeks of storms that have dumped rainfall 400% to 600% above normal levels. Almost 90% of California and about 33 million people are under flood warnings. That includes downtown LA. Those risks, along with the potential for drastic mudslides, have prompted evacuation orders for thousands of people, specifically in Montecito and along the Santa Barbara coast. Roads have been washed out, and there are fears houses could be swept away by cascades of mud. Over 200,000 customers are without power, and at least 16 people have died in these powerful atmospheric rivers thrashing the West Coast. More rain is forecast. Jackson Proskow has our top story tonight.
California just can't catch a break, with storm after storm pounding the state, an unrelenting deluge.
It's overflowing the creek and coming in.
This time, the water came so fast, people struggled to escape the flash floods, as huge pieces of debris were washed away, destroying everything in their path.
It was just a shocker, and it was just unbelievable.
A 5-year-old boy was swept away after the car he was traveling in with his mother was overwhelmed. So far, rescuers have only found his shoe. Dozens of people were plucked to safety, rescued by air and from below ground, where a mother and daughter had to be pulled from a sinkhole that swallowed 2 cars.
We're in the midst of a series of significant and powerful storms.
Thousands of Californians are under evacuation orders as officials fear more mudslides like this one. Over the last few weeks, a series of atmospheric rivers has pummeled the state with an entire season's worth of rain. In the oversaturated soil, little stands a chance, and there's still more to come.
The parade of storms continue. It looks like Northern California will bear the brunt in the coming days, and then this weekend, the rest of the state will once again see heavy rainfall, mountain snow, and potential flooding.
Damage is likely to run into the billions, while residents are left to pick through the muddy mess.
And this is the biggest flood that we've seen since we've been here. It's crazy to see the flood line, overhead.
In a state plagued by disastrous fires and parched by drought, rain was welcome, but not so much so fast. Scientists warn it could all be part of a new normal in a changing climate, where California is more vulnerable than ever to floods that once seemed unthinkable. Jackson Proskow, Global News.
We can expect more weather disasters like that because of extremes triggered by climate change. And new data shows the world is warming at an alarming pace. The past 8 years were the 8 hottest on record. Temperatures are now 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than in the second half of the 19th century. And last summer was the hottest on record in Europe. The European continent, just like Canada, is warming much faster than the rest of the planet, a trend that is fueling concerns about more catastrophic weather to come. Eric Sorensen explains.
Extremes just in the last year. The atmospheric rivers in the Pacific, Europe's heat wave that saw London break temperature records, the tropical hurricane that brought destruction as far north as Newfoundland and Labrador, and the constant accelerating loss of ice in Canada's Arctic. All have one trend in common, according to the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service. Human activity is warming the planet, and experts say more extremes are coming.
The trend is exactly parallel with the climate scientists' forecasts. The climate crisis is here, and we have to make steps against it immediately.
The last 100 years, global temperatures have changed from patterns of cooler and warmer to increasingly warm years, especially recently. The hottest years of all were in 2016 and 2020. Now, 2022 shows overall another exceedingly warmer year for global temperatures. It was cooler this past year over the Canadian prairies, for example. And look at the cool La Nina current in the Pacific. It would normally suppress global temperatures, and yet this was still the 5th hottest year on record. The global temperature average shows the steady rise the last 40 years, with the last 8 years since 2014 being the 8 hottest years ever. Unfortunately, the trend is not reversible in the near future.
If we were to actually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to zero tomorrow, we would see no slowing in the rate of warming of the climate system for at least 20, 30, 40 years.
Gordon McBean says governments must work together within nations and internationally to reduce emissions, but also to adapt our infrastructure and change how we live to mitigate the harm from climate change while preparing for the extremes still to come.
We have to learn to adapt, but we also need to reduce our emissions so that we don't go to totally destructive temperatures.
McBean says climate science must be reported, repeated, and continually updated to counter the false information that so many people seek out. He says Canadians have added incentive to engage on climate change. Because of our northern latitude, this country is warming at twice the global average, and the Canadian Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Burning fossil fuels is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. A little later, Heather Yurix West looks at the just transition, shifting workers to clean energy jobs. It is a hot topic in Alberta. But first, in British Columbia, a police officer has died and another is critically injured after they were caught in an avalanche in the province's West Kootenay region. The off-duty officers were skiing in a remote area north of Nelson when they were swept down the mountain. 28-year-old Constable Mathieu Nollet remains in intensive care. 43-year-old Constable Wade Tittamore did not survive.
We're a small police force with a true family dynamic, and this tragedy is devastating to us here in Nelson. These are fine men and fine officers, and the whole community is hurting.
Avalanche Canada says the snowpack across much of Western Canada is dangerously weak. Experts are comparing it to the conditions in 2003, one of the deadliest avalanche years on record. The federal government has appointed a special representative to help address one of the calls for justice in the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Jennifer Moore-Rattray will provide advice and recommendations to support the creation of an Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson.
Through the engagement with families, survivors, and partners, Ms. Moore-Rattray will provide us with guidance and advice on how to best address this critical call for justice on accountability in particular in a way that is both meaningful and relevant.
Moore-Rattray is the former executive director of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Toronto police have identified the man killed in a stabbing last month. 59-year-old Ken Lee was stabbed on December 18th and died later in hospital. 8 girls between the ages of 13 and 16 were arrested. Police believe they had congregated from across the GTA after meeting online. All of them have been charged with second-degree murder. Canada will buy an American-made surface-to-air missile system worth hundreds of millions of dollars for Ukraine. That announcement was made in Mexico City today at the so-called 3 Amigos summit of leaders from Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Border security and migration are also on the agenda, but as Mackenzie Gray reports, nations outside of North America were top of mind today.
The 3 Amigos meeting in sunny Mexico City, marking the Prime Minister's first major trip of 2023.
North America is the largest free trading bloc in the world, larger even than the European Union.
Trudeau's trade-focused trip paid off in part. A dispute between Canada and the U.S. over the treatment of American border guards has significantly slowed the popular Nexus program since March 2020. But today, a breakthrough. In the spring, Canadian applicants will be able to get an interview at certain Canadian airports and then fly to the U.S. to complete their American Nexus interviews. Welcome news for the nearly 100,000 Canadians on the waitlist.
The reality is Americans want Canadians to come and have easy access to our country for tourism and travel and trade.
The war in Ukraine, also a major topic, with Canada announcing their single biggest military purchase for Ukraine yet. spending $406 million to buy American-made National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, which are highly effective at shooting down Russian drones and rockets.
Having an air defense system available to the Ukrainians is literally a life and death issue. If you don't have air defense nowadays in a contemporary or against a relatively modern foe, you will die.
The purchase welcomed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, thanking Canada for protecting Ukrainian skies. But unlike other weapons given to Ukraine, Canada itself lacks this capability.
The Canadian Armed Forces has none air defense systems from the ground to the air. And I would challenge anybody, any academic scholar out there, to find me one other army in the world that has no air defense systems.
In another international crisis, the Biden administration pushing for help on Haiti, hoping Canada would lead a security force to try and deal with gangs blockading ports and frequent kidnappings. Trudeau wouldn't commit to that, instead focusing on sanctions and aid for local police.
What we do this time allows for the Haitian people to get the situation under control, and a big part of that is putting those sanctions on the Haitian leadership.
Joe Biden also told Trudeau that he would visit Canada in March. Now, there's no date or itinerary yet for the president's trip, but it will be the first visit of a sitting president here in Ottawa since Barack Obama addressed Parliament in 2016. Donna?
And that was a while ago. Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa, thanks. The U.S. president is facing criticism after some classified documents dating back to when he was vice president were found at his former private office. Joe Biden's personal lawyers discovered about 10 files, some marked top secret, in a locked closet in his Washington office of the think tank, the Penn Biden Center. The next day, they were handed over to the National Archives, and the matter is under review by the Justice Department. Biden's critics are comparing it to the discovery of top secret documents found in a raid of former President Donald Trump's Florida estate. Hundreds of documents were found there in Trump's possession, and he repeatedly resisted requests to return the materials. The Biden administration is under growing pressure to expel Brazil's far-right former president Jair Bolsonaro from the U.S. after his supporters' brazen attack on Brazil's capital. Bolsonaro was admitted to a Florida hospital on Monday with stomach pains. He says he's now been discharged. His supporters want him restored to power and the newly inaugurated leftist president who won the election ousted. Many of those arrested after the riot were released by the police today after being questioned. More than 1,000 people were detained after that anti-government attack. Peru has barred former Bolivian President Evo Morales from entering the country as Peru blames foreign left-wing interests for the latest round of deadly protests in that country's south. Violence intensified on Monday, with the country's Human Rights Office saying at least 17 people were killed in brawls between anti-government protesters and police. Overall, nearly 40 deaths have been connected to the weeks-long unrest. Demonstrations started in December. They've been met by a harsh government crackdown that's been criticized heavily by Morales, one of the region's most prominent leftists. The UK's failure to launch coming up, why there's still optimism about launching satellites from the UK. Alberta's premier is pushing back on plans by the federal government to introduce new legislation about the transition from jobs in the oil and gas industry to clean energy. A bill to help them transition was a campaign promise of the federal Liberals. Alberta's premier doesn't like it. And as Heather Yureks West reports, it's setting the stage for a battle that could help everyone but the workers themselves.
Chad Miller built a successful career in Alberta's oil fields, but after 25 years, Miller is making a backup plan, developing a mobile educational game about drilling that he hopes to turn into a successful business.
Sooner or later, push comes to shove, they are going to wean a lot of this down, and there's nothing we can do. You adapt or you don't.
Driven out of the sector by punishing boom-bust cycles and an uncertain future, oil and gas workers are leaving faster than the industry can cope.
We did a survey, and in the energy services sector, supply and manufacturing alone, we have close to 3,000 job openings.
It's why industry advocates like Inserva are concerned about the timing of the Liberal government's just transition legislation. The bill to help workers move from oil and gas to clean energy jobs is expected to be introduced early this year.
We will continue to advocate on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of workers whose livelihoods depend on this industry. And we expect the federal government to stand up for our world-leading oil and natural gas workers instead of trying to eliminate their jobs.
Alberta and Ottawa's looming battle over the future of these workers comes with plenty to gain, both for the Prime Minister and Danielle Smith, who faces an election in just 4 months. But
this isn't just political posturing. There's also a really profoundly important policy issue that's at stake here, and that is whether Canada is going to take significant action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And the fact is, Canada cannot reach its emissions targets if the oil and gas sector doesn't make a big change. It's why workers like Miller aren't waiting around.
You save a bunch of money for the time that you're down, and then all of a sudden the government will throw in a wrench in it, and then you don't know whether or not you're going to go to work or have to transition to a different career. And it's hard on yourself. It's hard on your mental stability and your family.
In a global energy transition, nobody wants to be left behind. Heather Yurex, West Global News, Calgary.
Out of pocket ahead, inflation's impact on a Halifax entrepreneur. Property owners in Toronto are facing a big hike in taxes. Mayor John Tory tabled the city's budget for 2023. He says Torontonians can expect a 5.5% property tax hike. That would cost the average household an additional $233. Tory says the hike is necessary to maintain city services. We know inflation is having an impact on Canadians of all walks of life. Tonight, in the first of a series, we go to Halifax to see how a young professional is running a small business in addition to her full-time job and still finding it hard to make ends meet. Amber Friday brings us her story.
It's been just over a year since Megan Simon started a small charcuterie business. And despite the rising costs of food, she insisted on keeping her prices the same for as long as possible.
Slowly but surely, the package of cheese got smaller and the price got higher. And then delivery paid a part because gas was going up just consistently week after week.
Meanwhile, in addition to her entrepreneurial venture, Simons also works a full-time job. She says she never imagined the economic climate would be this dire.
I didn't anticipate it would hit me this hard. I didn't think it would be this hard this fast. I just pay attention to a lot more things, what I'm consuming, how I'm consuming it, how frequently.
Meanwhile, economist Stephen Brown says the inflation increase has been double what was projected.
Even the economists that were suggesting inflation would be high misread how high it would go. Partly that was due to the war in Ukraine pushing up commodity prices, but I wouldn't say it was all that. I think we've also underestimated inflation pressures elsewhere too.
Brown says he anticipates headline inflation will drop below 2% next year and that there could be a moderate recession. But
there's been a lot of market optimism in the last few weeks because China's it's eased its sort of COVID restrictions. In theory, that means the economy should recover. But I think the route to the full recovery is not going to be a pleasant one.
But in the face of inflation, Simon says she's grateful that it hasn't impacted demand.
New clients have still come on, old clients still making their same orders as well.
Simon says even through the trying time, she's eagerly anticipating expanding her business in the near future. She hopes to become a sommelier so she can offer an in-home wine tasting along with her charcuterie experience. Amber Friday, Global News, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia.
No space for error. Next, why a failed rocket launch isn't a complete loss.
Godspeed Cosmic Girl on this historic both European and UK mission to open space for everyone.
This Boeing 747 took off from England last night on a mission to make history, but it didn't quite work out. The Virgin Orbit flight was supposed to launch a rocket carrying satellites into orbit, a first for the UK. There was a huge crowd watching and millions on the line, but it didn't happen. Redmond Shannon explains what went wrong and why engineers are not giving up.
When we think of launching satellites into space, this is normally what comes to mind. But this takeoff from southwest England is part of the new era of commercial space launches. An attempt to send the first ever satellites into orbit from Western European soil. The rocket deployed like this from the wing of a jumbo jet at 35,000 feet.
It appears that Launcher 1 has suffered an anomaly.
But unfortunately, something went wrong with the rocket just as it was reaching orbit.
Absolutely devastated. We put our heart and soul into this, and it's such a personal journey for me as well, and my family were here.
Canadian Melissa Thorpe is the head of England's new spaceport, still digesting the loss of the 9 small satellites into the Atlantic Ocean.
Feeling better. Yeah, it was pretty upsetting initially, but it is space, and you got to get back up and do it again.
Her customer, Virgin Orbit, isn't too discouraged. 4 of its 5 previous launches from California made it to space.
If you look at one of the most successful launch companies right now, that's SpaceX, you only have to look at the early days to realize that they were very, very close to failing. Many of their early rockets failed.
Virgin Orbit part owner Richard Branson also used horizontal launches for his Virgin Galactic space trips, all part of the space boom.
Globally, I think there's something like 70 new spaceports planned around the world. I know even Canada has a few in the pipeline.
Including one planned for Nova Scotia, which will use vertical rocket launch pads, with plans to launch satellites from the Maritimes as early as 2025. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
If you know anyone chasing the latest sneaker, you're going to want to know about this. Nike is releasing the Dunk Low Montreal Bagel. The limited edition Montreal Bagel sneaker is described as having carb lover colors, otherwise known as beige, and they're sprinkled with sesame seeds. Nike says the blue swoosh is a shout out to the city from La Belle Provence. You'll have to shell out $120 US of your hard-earned dough. Reviews are mixed. Some people are holding out for the poppy seed version. And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is North Bay, Ontario. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.